Great. Well, we'll make a start this evening, Josie. There'll be some people sliding in throughout the session, no doubt. And thank you very much for agreeing to be our guest this evening.
It's my pleasure.
Yeah, no, very good. And we aim as many times as possible to try and get outside influencers who know their space very well to be able to share their insights in areas that probably aren't our expertise, but are very, very relevant to our audience as well. So thank you very much for agreeing. And your understanding of change management and culture is really what we want to tap into this evening and make aware, because the audience that we typically deal with are always faced with change, whether it be client change, staffing changes, economic changes, everything that goes with it. So change is a constant, to quote one famous Greek. So in terms of your experience, and I think people have read your profile already, and I know you've had a lot to do with change management on a large corporate scale, and you also deal as a business coach as well with one-on-one. So you've done it at all levels. So in that regard, we're very fortunate to be able to get your insights. And I know you said you've got some examples you want to share with us this evening.
Yes.
So if I could start with a question, and that is, what role does culture play in teams and in businesses? Is it a small part or is it a key part?
Yeah, thanks, Craig. So culture is the soup. It's everything to your organization, your company, your team. And it's kind of like when you're in the soup. So you're not always aware that there are cultural forces at play. So it's always really to your advantage to really understand the culture that you're in, because it's going to affect the way in which people relate to each other, the way in which they relate to their work, and the way in which they relate to the outside world. So those three dimensions are really important, and culture will affect those three areas. So if you're kind of blind to the environment you're in, you probably are missing some really important information when you're making decisions, and particularly strategic decisions. So it's critical. I find it's very critical.
So those three elements, again, how they relate to the people, how they relate to work, and how they relate to the world.
That's right. Them. Exactly.
Are they all dependent upon each other? Is it like a Venn diagram thing going on here?
In some ways, yes. So there are actually 6 areas where we can really describe culture. So what I might do is I might share some slides, and it might be helpful to go back and just have a really quick kind of brief on what is culture and what are the dimensions that affect those 3 outcomes. And then, because they are in a way interdependent, because they're all being shaped by these 6 forces, if you like. So I might just share my screen. Hopefully I can just do that here, and we'll get going. All right, so, oh, great. All right, so what I might do is actually take you to this slide here. See if I can get it into presentation mode. Are you seeing that okay?
Yes.
All right, so when we describe culture, what we usually are looking at are the symbols around us, what we see. It could be the way in which, the way in which people put things up in the office. It could be the logo. It could be the kinds of even desks in an office. It could be how an office is structured in the physical way, or even in a virtual space, how we structure the virtual environment. These are symbols. They send messages. For example, if we are in an organization and you walk in and all the managers have their own offices, and then everyone else is in open plan, that symbolizes that there's quite a high power dimension going on in that organization. So those symbols, we process that information at lightning speed, but they're all around us. And then there's also the stories that we tell, the hero stories, if you like. And so sometimes we recognize culture because we're all listening to stories of success and stories of failure. And if you think about, heroes or even superheroes, they're usually quite flawed characters. They're usually characters that have really strong, superhero kind of characteristics or strengths, and often that means they have quite super strong weaknesses in other regards. And often those hero stories tell us a lot about an organization or a group as well. And then, of course, there'll be the rituals. And we often think of culture this way. We think of culture in terms of, how do people sort of, what are the routines in place on a given week in any structural workplace, or maybe it's the way people socialize together. Do people get together after work? Do they come together, for lunch? Do they celebrate birthdays together? Those rituals are the things like that we often pay attention to in terms of culture. But they don't, these symbols, heroes, rituals, and also values, the values that are kind of demonstrated in the organization, they're sort of intangible. So it's hard to kind of even measure what they are. And we don't really get a description of what organizational culture is until we look at the dimensions of culture. And these are things that we can measure and we can look at from a very tangible perspective. And these are the things that really make a difference to the three things I was talking about before: the way in which people relate to each other, the way in which they relate to their work, and the way in which they relate to the outside world. So if I can quickly go through these 6 dimensions, what we find firstly is organizational effectiveness. And this is the way in which any group or organization manages the work. So are people in that organization very goal orientated, or are they more sort of relaxed about how things get done, and it's more about they're not very purpose driven. They're more focused on, getting to that end result in any way. So for example, we saw a lot of financial organizations really crash and burn, particularly in the States, around subprime mortgages. And that was because in terms of their organizational culture, their effectiveness was more means orientated. In other words, those guys were just trying to make money, and that was the goal, but they didn't really care how they made it. They knew that they were bringing in subprime mortgages, subprime investments, but they were telling investors that they were prime investments. So you can, when you have a very means orientated culture versus a more goal orientated culture or purpose driven culture, you end up with some very, sometimes, fraudulent activity, criminal activity, unethical activity. So that dimension tells us about, how important is it that people are effective and efficient in that organization, and are they driven by purpose or not? So hopefully we've got organizations that are more driven by purpose than not. The other dimension is the level at which the organization is customer orientated. And you might say, well, all organizations are customer orientated, and that's true, but you can see it on a continuum. At the higher end of that continuum, the customer is king. Anything the customer wants, the organization bends over backwards to give it to them. And sometimes, again, if you're on the extreme end of that, you don't really care about the rules you break as long as you're meeting the demands of the customer. So you can see how kind of being on the extreme ends of these is probably not a great thing in terms of values in an organizational culture. But there are, on the other side of the scale, you can have an organization that's not very customer orientated at all. They're more internally focused. So they might be an organization that perhaps think, well, we know what's best for the customer. We will tell the customer what they need. And so that will drive the culture. That will drive how the organization sees itself in relation to the outside world. And they're not likely to bend over backwards for customers. They're probably not likely to even think about customers when they think about the work that they do. So to give you an example of this, military organizations are not very customer orientated. They're very internally focused. They're very internally orientated because they need to be. They're very purpose driven, but they do not change their processes and procedures according to what the governments of the day, which might be like their customers, like the Senate or the Parliament, what they want. They are internally driven. They have goals and they are very regimented in the way they achieve their goals. So an organization like the military, not very customer orientated. An organization like Netflix, very customer orientated. So they're likely to change their product offering, their services, the way they run their business model, all based on customer demand. And their goal is to delight customers. So they want to get to the point where customers choose them, the customer is referring their friends to Netflix. So they are on the extreme end of customer orientation. However, Netflix also has some regulations that they have to abide by. So in some ways, they wouldn't be totally on the extreme end of customer orientation. So the other dimension is control. And when we think about control, we're thinking about what's the level of control in the organization. And this is the way people in the organization relate to each other. Are they easygoing, informal? Are people sort of a bit relaxed about the rules? Or on the other side, is there strict discipline in the organization, and mistakes are not tolerated, and everybody has to go, kind of get into a line around how to behave? So level of control is literally about that, how easygoing or how strictly disciplined an organization is. The next dimension is focus, and focus talks about, is the organization locally focused, or are they, again, externally or focused or more professionally focused? So for example, you might have an architectural firm. An architectural firm is more likely to be professionally focused because architects are part of a larger specialized group of trained individuals, and they see themselves as specialists, and they almost have a guild in a way because they're trained. So for example, if two architects meet, they'll probably talk about their profession. They'll think about it from, what's best practice in our field. They reward people for being the best in their class in terms of design. They really care about that. They care about how their colleagues who have similar specializations see them from a professional standpoint. So focus from an architectural point of view, they will have a very professional, externally driven focus. And they're also more likely to have a longer term orientation on what they do. So for example, an architectural firm might accept a job that maybe isn't as profitable, but in the long term might lead them to getting one of those design awards, for example, so that the orientation is much more long-term. Whereas when an organization is more locally focused, their orientation is probably more short-term. They're thinking about, just protecting what they have right now and not necessarily thinking about the long-term future. So focus is another way in which we can really measure culture. Openness is one of those things that sometimes you feel when you walk into an organization or a new group or even a workspace. How open, welcoming, warm is that environment? Or is it a closed environment with lots of secrecy and you have to go through hoops to be initiated for you to be, privy to some of those secrets? So, and again, we can see military organizations very closed, tech companies necessarily open, but not too open because they have secrets they don't want shared either. So they're going to be less open than some other organizations. But for example, Patagonia, which is a service organization, they are very open. They share their profits even with their employees. So they tend to be very open. Everybody knows the way in which their business runs, and they see that as in some ways their community duty to sort of share that with others. So they see themselves as part of a community. So it's not just about the company, it's about them being part of a community. So in some ways, openness really suits them. It suits their values and what they're trying to be in their community. Then lastly, the last dimension is leadership style. And in particular, leadership style is important because we feel this really personally, don't we? We can go into an organization that's very work orientated, where people don't matter that much, or we can, on the other side of that, go into an organization where the company really cares about its people. It actually even maybe is co-responsible for the welfare of employees as well. So, this is where you have maybe some companies that go above and beyond in terms of giving benefits to their employees. They are very mindful of what's going on in people's lives, not just at work. And so they'll take that into consideration in relation to workload, in relation to reward and recognition. So when you have an organization that's very employee focused, you have a lot of consideration in the way that that work and people interact. But when you have an organization that's very work orientated, people don't matter as much in the way in which the organization makes decisions. So they want the best people, but they're not necessarily going to think that they're responsible for the welfare of their people. So and you can see this sometimes, for example, in some countries where people are working in organizations, but maybe the conditions aren't great. Leadership of that company doesn't necessarily do much to make the life of their employee better. That's not part of the national culture, let alone the organizational culture. And that's something to also be very aware of. Organizational cultures will be affected and really influenced by national culture. And so a lot of the work and research that we know that tells us a lot about organizational culture actually comes from studies of national culture. So you can see some of these dimensions playing out at the national level too. So it's important to, understand that. And sometimes companies are multinational, and so you will find that different parts of the company have different cultures as well. So it really depends how these things play out in terms of their effects on, as I said, people, the work, and the way in which they see the outside world. But culture is really important, and hopefully this has also given you a bit of a broader view of what culture is, because culture is not just the way in which people are engaged. Sometimes we measure culture through employee engagement. But as I've explained here, it's a lot more than that. Just employee engagement will probably give you a sense of maybe the leadership style of an organization and maybe the level of openness of an organization, but it won't tell you much about those other dimensions that I've mentioned. And it's important to really understand culture, because culture, we know, strong culture, effective culture, or optimal culture makes a difference to organizational outcomes. It's the reason people stay in an organization. It affects the way people could perform in an organization, and it also affects the kinds of customers you're able to attract in an organization. So it's really critical to the health, sustainability, and growth of any company.
The 6 levels I love, Josie, but there was at the very start, the effectiveness. I jotted down a question straight away, which I'm sure you've come across before, and that is, we've got some young managers and some experienced leaders on the call who, in many ways, try and wonder whether the culture has been by design or by default.
Yep.
And that is, so if the manager comes in, hangs around the office at the end of the day, and there's a couple of guys playing table tennis and having beers, and then new people join, there's a few more playing table tennis and having beers. Does it now become a table tennis and having beers culture? And was that in his or her original plan? And I doubt it was. So how important is it for design to come into it when a young person's starting up a company? And I know you've started up a few companies yourself.
Yes.
How important is that to keep that at the front of mind? That is, this is what we're building, and this is how it'll look.
It's such a good question. Sorry, Craig, sorry to interrupt you, but it is such a good question because it's critical. So, and I've done that with all of the companies that I've started. I start off with, what are my values? And you can see that the center is values. What are my values, and how do I want that demonstrated? And in order to achieve my strategy. And this is why you can't mimic someone else's culture. You can't just copy someone else's culture. So you can't say, well, I want to be like Apple they've got a great culture. Or I want to be like Google. People seem to have a lot of fun at Google, and employees seem to have a lot of autonomy. I want to mimic that, but that doesn't necessarily work for other organizations. You need to understand, what are your values, what are your strengths and values, and what are you trying to achieve, what's your strategy, and then map your culture to that, and then deliberately shape it, like you're saying. Because otherwise you will get kind of culture happening by osmosis, but it may not be the culture you want. And it also might be the culture of the few dominant people in the room. It's their idea of culture, not your idea of culture. So it's really important to shape that culture. And you can shape that culture by firstly focusing on which parts of those dimensions that I've talked about you want to be at. So for example, when one of my businesses is Higher Spaces. I run a co-working space, and we had my business partner and I have a value around really bringing our whole selves to work. We wanted to create an environment where people feel very included. And when I looked around at some of the other co-working spaces, I could see that some of them were, they looked like Google in a way. They had the ping pong tables, and they had beer on tap, and they had a lot of, features like that. And then I looked at the statistics in Australia and saw that most entrepreneurs are actually 45 and over. They're not 20. And I thought, if most of the entrepreneurs are 45 and over, and they're the kind of people that we want to attract, I might be excluding them by being like that co-working space that has the ping pong and the beer on tap. And who else might I be excluding? I might be excluding women who may necessarily not be too into beer on tap and ping pong. And I might be excluding people who are more introverted and would like nothing, would think that's the worst part of their day, is to have a beer at the end of the day and have to do some kind of competitive sport. So you have to think about, what are your values? What are you trying to attract to your business? Why are you there? Why? This is what purpose is, and values drive purpose. Why are you there? What are you trying to do? Because that's what you'll attract. And so shaping culture is really important. And I do have a way of, like, I've got a few tips about how to do that if we want to go there, Greg.
Yeah, definitely, because shaping culture is, and again, our audience and our member base are very much, they'd call themselves, entrepreneurial of mindset.
Yeah.
But they're probably closer to the beer and the ping pong, so much so that it might even be beer pong. And that's not, and that's sometimes the audience that, as you were saying, it's not necessarily who they're trying to, attract.
Yeah.
But it tends to be putting a hand in a glove for some, and or whether that be quiz nights, or whether it be, adventure weekends.
Something else.
Yes.
Exactly.
And so how can they shape it? Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And and don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that culture is wrong. And this is the other thing. There is no wrong or right culture. Is the culture optimal for your strategy and your values, what you're trying to create? That's what you've got to get. Is it optimal? So you can do this by thinking about the best day you can imagine in your business and what's going on. And that's why I call these signature moments. If you can imagine what would be the best day, what would be the things that you go home to your partner and your loved ones and you go, you know what, today was awesome. We did ABC. This happened, ABC, and you're excited. That's a signature moment. And we often, in marketing, we apply this to customer experience. This is kind of often, a lot of brainstorming and marketing teams around how can we create these signature moments for our customers where we are surprising them, delighting them, creating experiences that really demonstrate to them who we are, typifying our brand, and it kind of shines our distinctiveness and it makes it memorable, something iconic. And so those signature moments, we can actually think about those in terms of our company culture, in our organization, in our team. How do we create those signature moments that really signify what we're all about? And so the way to do that is by creating moments that are memorable and personal, and maybe they're revealed over time. They have to be something useful and tangible and something enjoyable. So it can be an experience, or it can be the allowance or permission to do something differently at work. So to give you an idea, ANZ wanted to build a culture of innovation. And, when I think of ANZ, I don't, especially the banks, I don't necessarily think of the banks as very kind of vanguard in terms of their entrepreneurial culture or innovation, but they really wanted to build that innovation. And so, and this was some of the leaders in their IT teams got together and said, what if we made every Friday an innovation day? And what if every Friday, people could put their hand up to be part of it? You didn't have to be part of it. You could put your hand up to be part of it. And you could be part of like a design thinking sprint, a problem solving sprint, where you could say, I want to solve this problem that we're having for this customer. And to do this, I need these 5 people over there to join me. And so the company said, yes, you can do that. If you want to put your hand up, we'll give you those 5 people. We'll take them off their daily duties for that Friday, and you can spend the whole Friday just working very focused in a autonomous team environment on solving that problem. And the team at ANZ did this, and I actually remember going to talk to them about that because I thought it was an amazing innovation for them. And they, by the end of their 3rd month, they had solved 80 problems for customers. These were pain points for customers that customers had on their digital platform, or perhaps when they're dealing with any of the digital spaces, even inside the branches. So you can see how they quickly shaped something very different in their culture by allowing their staff, even just for that one day, to experience a different way of working. Because on that day, they weren't tied into the normal day-to-day work that they would normally do. They were told, you can just do anything you like for that day. A lot of tech companies do that.
This empowerment and permission. Exactly. I was just reading something on the exact same level. Mike Cannon-Brookes and Russ Farquhar from Atlassian, they call them FedEx days, and they do a hackathon of I think it's 24 hours they're given, but they're given permission. They can work in their teams. Yeah. They call them FedEx days because you need to deliver something at the end of it. So, in other words, it's not just go and play. It's let's solve a problem that's a pain point, as you correctly put it, for the company or for the customer. Exactly. And they claim they've had some of their best innovations from those because they've been empowered to do it. And now it's become a cultural shift for them.
That's right.
There are examples when companies get it right, and it wouldn't be fair, I suppose, if we didn't do the flip side with what you've seen and experienced. And and we're not throwing anyone under the bus, but what happens when teams get it wrong, or companies that get culture wrong, or they've misread the room, or they're doing it for the wrong reasons? Have you got examples or what to watch out for?
I do. And it's often actually not that they get it wrong, but they don't do it well. So they don't follow through. So I've seen a lot of examples where companies are creating that kind of enthusiasm, and they get the buy-in in the team around, we're going to do something different. We're going to shape the culture in a different way. And then they don't follow through with it. I'll give you an example of that. So for example, I worked at Telstra for 7 years as a change manager in strategic change in the networks and IT and customer service area. And we had at that time a real movement towards becoming more adept at problem solving. So we wanted to be much more customer orientated. We wanted to be open, and we wanted teams to be able to come together as sort of cross-functional teams to solve problems. And so what we created was these ring-fenced teams that were given kind of, sort of like the Atlassian kind of remit. You have to deliver something, but they were given months to do it. They were ring fenced. They were given some consultants to work with. They were trained in that area, and what they were implementing was sort of a way of reducing waste out of our processes. Because at the time, and Telstra has never been the poster child for customer service, but at the time, customers were spending hours and hours and hours being, transferred from one department to the other. So these teams were sort of solving some of the problems that customers were having, just, dealing with such a big bureaucracy as Telstra. And so a lot of people in the company started to hear about this, and they were really getting on board in terms of that there's going to be some change, and leaders started to talk about it. And we could see that there was this, that, everyone was sort of, on board and saying, this is the right direction we should be going in. And these were test teams, right? So when you have a test and learn environment, you have to allow for failure. And you have to allow for people to fail and not get, run, sort of stripped over the coals for the failure. You have to allow for a process where they fail, they learn really quickly, they fail, they learn really quickly. But what started to happen is that leaders started to get very impatient with the failure. And so they cut the program after about 3 months. And really the program should have gone for about 9 months. And what it did in the organization was really show people that although the organization had paid lip service to wanting to be different, wanting to be more, give employees more autonomy and empowerment, wanting to give customers a better experience, when it came to really putting their money where their mouth was, they couldn't do it. They couldn't do it. They couldn't follow through. And what you then get is heightened cynicism, less engagement from people. And the next time you want people to change, they don't believe it. So it's harder to get them across the line on change. And that's kind of what happened. And so that was at a time where, Telstra was saying, we want to be this new culture, but if you put things in place to shape that, you have to follow through. You can't get it wrong like that. So that's just one example.
The probably key thing, and there are some companies who do it, as we said, do it very well, and all of a sudden it becomes a cultural shift, and everyone not only implementing it, but they're also enforcing it. That is, I often think of Melbourne Storm, you're not far from here, who have a inside the circle, outside the circle model of this is the way we operate, this is not how we operate. And
yes,
if you're outside the circle, you're outside the circle. And it takes them a while, but they all seem to get on board. In a smaller company, whose responsibility is it? We say the manager, but whose responsibility and who else can play a part in helping? I'm thinking monitoring rather than policing. The culture, that is, we see someone that's doing something that's against the culture or not within our culture or in the circle, to use, as I say, the Melbourne Storm model.
Yeah.
Who's it upon to call it out, and is it professional courage required there? How can smaller companies really work on those things there rather than, they say if you condone it, you own it. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Look, I think it is everybody's responsibility, but in the end, leadership have to drive it. So strategy and culture are both accountabilities of leadership. And then everyone has a role in implementing it. So everyone has a role in maintaining and making sure things get done, and creating opportunities for teams to make that happen. But the CEO and the senior leaders play a big role in that, because attention flows upwards. So if you're not seeing behaviours role modelled at the top, and if they're not doing anything about, people who are outside the circle, to use, a Melbourne Storm metaphor, then you will slowly get kind of lapses by others. So people need to believe it. And so it is everybody's responsibility. And everyone can have a, you know, a sense of shared leadership around that.
Yeah.
Absolutely, absolutely. But you really do need senior leaders to get this right. And I tend to think like the job of leaders is really to drive strategy and drive culture. It's simple. That's all they need to do, and the rest will fall into place. Because people want to be in cultures that help them flourish. They really want to have that sense of we are here, we're all in this together, and we know what is you know, kind of in the kind of remit of acceptable, and we know what we're here for. So if when you have teams where the culture absolutely fits the team's purpose, you get this hum. It's like a beautiful thing. It's like a beautiful note. I'll give you another example too. So I recently met Matt Barnett, who's the CEO of Bonjoro. I don't know if you know Bonjoro, but they developed the kind of in-email video technology. So you can send someone an email, but it's a video. And he's actually he's Australian, he's from Sydney, but he's got this multinational company now. But he wanted to create this culture of just fun. And so when he started, he hired people who were kind of like him, you know, because what they used to do is they used to go on camping trips with all the staff. They used to, you know, so he said, I need to hire people who I like to hang out with because we go camping, you know. So that was the sort of thing. But actually, the whole company is based on his product is based on engagement. That's what the heart of his company is actually engagement. So he does need to bring that culture into his staff. So if his staff are not engaged themselves, if they're not empowered, if they don't feel like they have that level of autonomy, they're not likely to then be sort of, you know, able to service clients who are trying to build that into their own businesses. And when I look at, you know, I've dealt with some of his staff, and all his staff are really, like, you get a sense that they know what they're there for. They're buzzed about the product that they're helping you with and they're selling. They don't really even sell it because they just talk about it in such glowing terms about the benefits of it. And so you can see that they all have this, like, they're all quite a tight-knit family. And to the point where they call Matt Papa Bear, and they have this, like, their logo is a bear, and they even send their customers like bear merch, you know, like maybe they're small bears or bears, like they wear, the staff sometimes go dressing up in bear suits, you know, onesies, like bear onesies. So they take it to that fun extreme, and they send their customers all this fun stuff, socks with bears on them. And but they that's their thing, being innovative around engagement, and they live it and breathe it. So when it happens, when you see it, you can see it. It's like a no-brainer. But that hasn't come from osmosis. That's actually come from very deliberate action where the CEO had a value around this and has maintained it. And he thinks about it every day.
Yeah. I'll just get you to stop share there if you can.
Sorry.
Grace,
yeah, sure.
And just as we wind up with today, because there was, in terms of, with that last example, it seems like they are almost recruiting with culture in mind as well. So, and so it seems like if someone wants to, there was a beautiful Chinese proverb, and they always come up with good proverbs. The best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago and today, two best times.
Yes.
It seems like culture, if, I should have changed my culture a long time ago. Whereas if we have a business that's relatively new, it's only been going a few years, and they go, it's not where I need it to be. And that's just a chance to reset it, isn't it, in many ways? And to look at it, the recruiting part, in many ways, change the recruiting questions in some regards. If you're sitting with someone and just ask them more value-driven questions rather than performance-driven questions, or quite simple questions that could be asked things that around how they might act within an environment, and is that a good fit for our business,
Absolutely.
behaviourally?
Yeah, for sure. And you know, that's a really easy way to, well, recruitment is never easy, by the way, but it's
Yeah.
a really easy way to shape the process in a way where you know you're going to get a cultural fit. It makes such a big difference. And because you can train people, you can give them skills, you know, but there are mindsets that are easier, that are not as easy to shift. And so what you're looking for are those people that have that value fit, and that they have the kind of mindsets and behaviors already that are going to match the kind of culture that you're trying to shape, that it's that they're going to add value to that. And of course we need to think about diversity there as well, but you know, do they really, can you see them being part of this culture, being part of this, being part of the team of people who are, again, going back to where we started from the beginning, relating to each other in a particular way, relating to the work in a particular way, and relating to the outside world in a particular way, all of which you kind of want to be descriptive of your culture, and that is actually all about achieving your purpose. So yeah, recruitment is great. And if you don't have a chance to recruit new people, then there are things you can do to reset culture as well. And absolutely, and again, it's deliberate actions, and it's not just about getting people together and socializing. It's actually having a conversation about these things, about, you know, where do we sit, where, you know, what are the behaviors that demonstrate this cultural aspect for you? How could we do that more? It's kind of having those kind of conversations.
Great. And it was not in summary, that's the wrong term. Question if I can ask at the end, because usually topics like this pique people's interest, and there's those who've joined today, and they'll have the opportunity to view the recording once we've snipped it all up as we do. A book, there's always, you know, and a lot of people are fascinated by great cultures.
Yes.
You're saying the Netflix, the Amazons, you know, and the large organizations, but then there's some small ones too, as you were saying, the fellow with the bears, you know,
Yeah.
there too. Are there any books that you've recommended to people before that have got some really good stories, or some podcasts, or some websites where people go, what are some examples of good cultures? How have they done it? What have they done? And oh, wow, I like that. What? Because sometimes we're always looking for, what are some things that I could do as a business owner or as a leader?
Yes. Okay. Well, you know what? I do have a podcast where I talk about culture a lot, so people
Yes.
can join that if they want, and that's called Gears Action Growth.
Gears Action Growth.
Yeah, Gears Action Growth. So we kind of talk about culture a lot, and then also I really like Good to Great. I think that author talks a lot about you know, what it takes to make effective teams, and a lot of what he talks about is culture. And then if you're kind of interested in the psychology of culture, some people like to go deep, 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 then there is a book by Edgar Schein on it's called Organizational Culture. And if you like, I can give you the links, and we can share the links. And that goes into, you know, what it is that makes up culture and how to deliberately shape it. So there's a number of different sources there that I can share. And there's also a website that explains those 6 dimensions that I was talking about too. And that's the website is called Hofstede Insights. And again, I can share the link of that. And people, it's actually an interactive website where you can go into each dimension, and it gives you a description of what each dimension means. So you can use that to shape culture as well.
Great. Well, thank you. So we tapped into, see, this is where fast track people, they don't have to go through the whole library at the same time.
Exactly.
Thank you very much for your time this evening. It is appreciated. I know you've got clients upstairs too, you're looking after. So Josie coordinates quite a lot. I wouldn't say in her spare time, it's her time here. I think there's no such thing as spare time.
Exactly.
There. So really appreciate your time. I'll just, if I can, just at the very end, just going to share sorry, just at the very end, if you have, for those who've been on tonight, thank you very much. Feedback's always appreciated, and we've even made it easier for you now. And let's really jump into technology. There's a QR code that you can scan with your phone, as people do now. So you need your phone with you to be able to do all this. And you can send your feedback through to us, and that'd be appreciated there. But more than anything, we appreciate your time tonight, Josie, to talk all things culture. And
My
I
pleasure.
know very well there's a lot more in store there. So I encourage people also to, we'll share the chat as well, where we had the Gears Action Growth podcast, and Good to Great by Jim Collins.
Yeah.
There's an excellent podcast where he's interviewed by Brene Brown.
Oh, yes, that's
yes,
right.
mind-blowing,
That's right.
mind-blowing hearing the two of those talk. It's next level stuff, but it's so
It is,
engrossing.
isn't
I
it?
just shared it with Shane recently, actually, and he found it quite intriguing.
Yeah,
And the
I love Brene
Hofstede
Brown.
Insights,
Yeah.
we'll share that as well. But thank you very much again for your time, and thank everyone for your attendance this evening. So really appreciate it.
Bye, everybody.